Why do I need the paint color DNA table when I can just go look at the list of colorants on the paint can? I can just ask the store to give me a copy of the list of ingredients, the list of colorants that are going into the can for the color I want. I don't need to subscribe to the paint color DNA table to get the hue, value, and chroma notations. Why would I do that? That was a comment that someone left. I got tagged on the post because one of my subscribers shared that she had discovered the paint color DNA table and it didn't work like the ingredients list, like everyone was talking about in that thread, right? They were discussing the particular ingredients of a color. And she chimed in and she said, "You guys are barking up the wrong tree." I found this amazing tool called the paint color DNA table. And it does exactly what you guys are trying to do with the list of colorants, but you can't. And so then someone chimed in and said, "Well, I would never do that. You can just get the list of colorants for free from the store." And the paint color DNA table is not free, practically free. It's only $10.97 a month. But that is what inspired this live today, talking about the list of colorants, the paint color formula, why cutting it is not going to get you exactly what you think it's going to get you. And one of my Camp Chroma students actually sent me a DM on Facebook asking, "Well, why doesn't that work when we can cut it by 50%? You know, what exactly is going on?" So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Hey, Cheryl, nice to see you. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Marilyn. Nice to see everybody. Just so you know, some people's comments will show up in the stream and some people's comments and questions do not. But I see all of them. So I see you. So that's why I like to acknowledge you guys, because I don't know why that works that way. I don't know. And then after we talk, the comments and questions are nowhere to be found. I don't know. It's Instagram. So yeah, so those are the two things that inspired today's discussion about the paint color formulas compared to the paint color DNA table and why those list of ingredients are truly useless information. So let's get going with that. So with Benjamin Moore, when you get inside of their software, their formulation software at the store, the person helping you can select an option to cut a formula by 5%, 10%, 20%. They have the whole list of options that you can choose from. And I actually did that for Benjamin Moore's Decorator's White. We're going to use Chantilly Lace and Decorator's White today as the examples. And by default, we're also going to compare those colors in terms of their color appearance. Dory, I'm so glad you're here. We're talking about colorants. And the question you asked me on October 8th that I just found this week, I told you I'm behind. And Angel, if you're out there, I just found an email that you sent me asking questions about Camp Chroma, and I just found it. So I'm going to get back to you later today. I'm getting caught up. So yeah, Dory, I was telling everybody earlier that in addition to the DM that you sent me, I got tagged in another post where someone said, "Hey, I discovered the paint color DNA table. You guys need to go check that out." And it was a discussion about the list of colorants from Benjamin Moore. Yes, people said, "Well, does anybody know what W1 means and S2 means?" They're trying to decode the acronyms for the actual colorants. And so that kind of snowballed. And, the one person chimed in and said, "I can read that list of colorants and know exactly." And, you know how people do. Well, let me tell you why it doesn't work, right? A list of colorants, a paint color formula, doesn't define or describe color appearance in any way, shape, or form. And even if we wanted to try to reach, if we wanted to stretch and say, okay, if you do this every day, You're working with the same set of 12 or 14 colorants every day because you're a color mixer professional, and you have a sense of what the different proportions of those 12 little colorants you use every day to make 5,000 colors. You've gotten a sense of what those different proportions of those 12 colorants can add up to and how they can influence color appearance. Let's pretend that that could be true. With a capital P, pretend that that could be true. Just, humor me. Hypothetically, let's say that's true. The problem with that is we're only talking about one dimension of color. Again, pretending that it works. You're only looking at one dimension of color because the colorants only influence hue, directly influence hue. So if you're trying to look at the proportions of yellow oxide and black and white and determine something about a color's appearance from there, the only characteristic of color that this is speaking to is hue, right? How do the list of colorants talk about or speak to how light or dark a color looks? Well, there's nothing in here that indicates anything about how light or dark. What about chromaticity? How strong or weak? How neutral does the color look? There's nothing in the list of colorants that could even hint to that dimension of color. So at the very best, pretending in this hypothetical situation, in the best case scenario, the only thing the list of colorants can do is perhaps give you a hint as to its hue family. But it's missing the other two dimensions of color. Whoop, wrong finger. Got to be careful about that. The other two dimensions of color, and actually the single finger is probably more relevant than we think, because if you think that list of colorants is going to do the same thing for you as the paint color DNA table, you are kind of effed, right? So we're missing two dimensions of color, even if theoretically this could possibly work. So let me see. I have all kinds of stuff to show you. Where do we want to go next? Let's go to light and dark, because Benjamin Moore has formulated in percentages taking a color lighter or darker. So they've standardized that, right, across all of their stores. And the options are to change the formula only lighter or darker. Okay, so let's pretend that that is more effective than it sounds, right? It sounds super effective, but it's really not. But let's pretend it is. So now you have the list of colorants, and now you've cut it by 50% and made it lighter, because the choice is 50% lighter. Those adjustments are only lighter or darker in their system, what they've standardized. So let's pretend now, okay, it does cover hue. The colorants talk about hue. And now the adjustment talks about lighter and darker. So, okay, now we only have two dimensions of color. Chroma. Still, nothing is speaking to how chromaticity changes, right? So there isn't any part of the formula to begin with that describes a color's characteristics, even if you could decode the individual colorants and have some kind of mental understanding of how the different proportions add up to a particular hue. Even if you could pretend to do that, we're still missing chroma. There's no part in this process that tells you how weak or strong the color is, right? Well, then the argument is, well, you can look at how much colorant is used. If it's, at some benchmark, the smaller quantities of colorant would indicate a more neutral color. There is no way you could chart that out and make that into any kind of logical, repeatable process. because they're talking about the 16ths and, they do all the fractions things. So there's just nothing human readable about that. It is far too complex and too complicated. And the way that Benjamin Moore was able to standardize 20% lighter, 50% lighter, etc., is in theoretical color space, right? It's the math. It's the math. So they took a look at the C-Lab value of the individual colorants, and then they had to take a look at the C-Lab values all together to make a particular color, like elephant gray. And then it was the math that adjusted the proportions of each of those colorants to make worldly gray lighter. That is the only way. At some point in time along the way, in making those adjustments to the formula, someone had to calculate and quantify lighter. And someone had to establish some kind of a benchmark as to what 50% lighter actually means, what 20% lighter actually means. And I would love to see that qualification. Are they literally taking the lightness value from the C-Lab data value and doing the adjustments in the colorants to change that L value, the lightness value, so it's half as much as the original color, if we're talking 50% lighter? I would like to see that math, but we don't have access to that. So even though Benjamin Moore has standardized to a point, 50% lighter, cutting formulas, up to 75%, or darkening formulas going the other way, even though they've standardized that, it's not qualified. And I would like to see the qualification for exactly what does that mean, because there's a huge gap there. The reality of what it's actually doing and how those adjustments are going to be perceived by a person with normal color vision are two different conversations. So are those adjustments modeled the same way the C-Lab values are in color space? Because the C-Lab color space is what models human color perception? Or is it some kind of, Frankenstein numeric standard that they've come up with just so that they could cut the formulas exactly by 50%? The quantity of colorant. Does cutting a quantity of colorant by 50% literally in terms of the formula translate directly in a linear way to how it's actually perceived? So just because the formula, the colorants have been cut by 50%, there's a huge gap there to qualify if it's actually perceived as being half as light, if it's being perceived as 50% lighter. So pick that apart, right? There's a lot of pieces of information that are missing about this whole process and about that whole conversation. And my whole point is, why would you care? Why does anybody care? I don't care. Like, I would be curious to see the qualification for that and to see if it is some kind of a Frankenstein standard that really doesn't translate back to how human vision is modeled in the C-Lab color space. But, it's repeatable on their end, so that gives it some merit and usefulness. But I don't care. I'd just be curious about it. And the reason why I don't care is because you can just go to the paint color DNA table and get a set of data values that were created specifically to define and describe what color looks like to people, right? These values, LCH, that show up in all of the apps for all of the devices, and a Munsell notation, hue, value, and chroma, their only job is to tell you how light or dark a color looks, how much chroma a color has, and what hue family a color belongs to, right? They were engineered just for that job. The colorants were not. The formulas were not. That's not their job. So trying to pull information about color like lists of colorants to make them do jobs that they were never intended to do is not going to be successful. And again, why would you when you can just go to the paint color DNA table and look it up? So then the next question is, well, okay, so let's say I want a color that's lighter than agreeable gray. You learn how to use the filters at the top of the table, and you search for colors that have the same chroma as agreeable gray, the same hue family as agreeable gray, but is lighter. And then you can get a whole list of colors in terms of appearance. And then you have your list of colors on the paint color DNA table in one view, and you can go by lightness, chroma, and hue angle and make the decision about which color that is lighter than agreeable gray fits in with what you were envisioning in terms of how neutral or colorful it is, right? And then you can go get the chips. And that's the biggest part here. Cutting your formulas by 50%, 25%, you don't know what that's going to look like. Because again, it goes back to our original conversation. That has not been quantified nor qualified in terms of color appearance. The 50% cut formula only quantifies and qualifies how much colorant. There's nothing about color appearance in there, except for some calculation to determine how to cut the formula. So, and again, is that true? What does 50% lighter in formula actually mean? We don't know that. And the only way you can find out what that means is to walk in there and say, hey, I want elephant gray 50% lighter. I want decorator's white 50% lighter. And they're going to go, okay. And they're going to make it for you and give it to you. And then at that point in time, you own that can of paint. Right? And you can't do this, especially with colors of white. I don't think they can make you a sample cutting the formulas. I think in many cases with many of the whites and off-whites, you have to buy a quart. So you buy your quart of 50% decorator's white because you want it 50% lighter, which no one can qualify what that means. And you get it and you look at it and dang, it doesn't look a whole lot different from the original. Or because you messed with the formula, it ended up getting grayer, which can happen because there's no point of control for chroma in this process. So yeah, could you get a decorator's white that has a higher lightness value? Could happen, but you don't know how that's going to affect the other two dimensions of color. So the original formula, decorator's light, is 50% lighter. Great, right? Gave you what you asked for. That's what's in the computer. But nobody's talking about how that affected the hue or the chroma, right? You change the formula and it's going to affect all three dimensions of color, and no one's qualifying that, which is why it's a risk. So now you own the can of paint at 50% lighter decorator's white, and it's an unfortunate color now, but it's yours. So you can play that game. And a lot of times there's a lot of psychology to this too, especially with interior designers, because they think it's super cute to, like, you know, manipulate the formula in some kind of custom way because that makes them more designery, and, you know, they think it's super cute. I think it's one of the dumbest things you can do as a designer if you have a business. It's inefficient. You know, messing around with the formula just takes time and it's going to cost you money. Like, how many iterations of 50% lighter decorator's white are you going to stand there and mess with, and why? As opposed to understanding how to use hue, value, and chroma and manipulate the three dimensions of color and get to where you want to go in the paint color DNA table, you know, for basically free, because it's only $10.97 a month. And then once you figure it out in the DNA table, you can go get samples We never buy samples. We never invest in samples without a reason. And I've told you before, those sampleized bundles that are $35 or $40, and you get a whole, a range of, the most popular whites. Do not waste your money. Do not waste your money. You only spend time and money on colors that are relevant to a fixed finish or important element. There's no other reason to own a collection of sample boards. I have some of my color strategists who do collect the sampleized samples because it's nice to pull out the bigger chips when you're on site, but you can also get those for free from your rep and build a collection that way. So I'm not saying that it's not handy to have bigger chips with you on site in a consultation, because it is. What I'm saying is be smart about that investment. As in, you can get them for free from your rep. You can just order them. So when I pulled the formulas for Decorator's White, this is the original formula. This is the adjusted formula at 50% lighter. And, again, we can analyze these quantities and these acronyms for the colorants, and there's nothing in here that indicates how much lighter it is other than the standard that exists within the Benjamin Moore system to cut the formula by 50%. You still don't know what you're going to get, right? It's still hieroglyphics and unnecessary. That's the biggest point. Struggling with this is unnecessary. Just like struggling to see undertones is unnecessary. And that was really part of the conversation that I was tagged in. We had a little conversation offline about it. It's like, hey, thanks for tagging me, and thanks for, talking about the DNA table. And she said, yeah, once you know this information and once you see color through the lens of a hue value chroma notation, you cannot unsee it. And I'm like, I know. And then she's like, and all these people, it's kind of sad that, all of these people are spending so much time trying to cut the formulas, spending so much time getting all of the samples, practicing, thinking that they're going to wake up tomorrow and see undertones. They can't see undertones today, but they're going to practice for a couple hours, and tomorrow they're going to be able to see those undertones. We kind of had a little conversation about just how unnecessary it is. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, another inconsistency that you need to consider, is the formula changes. And I don't have a handle on this. I really don't. And again, I kind of don't care. The only thing I care about is when I get that color, when it's mixed and we paint a little sample and it's dry and I measure it. The only thing I care about is that it aligns in terms of its data values to the original target. I don't care what they have to do. I don't care what they put in the can to make that happen. I really don't. It's not my job. That's their job. Staying in my lane where I make money. I don't work in a paint store. No one's paying me to fart around with colorants. People are only paying me for the results. So that's all I'm interested in. What is the result of whatever you're doing over there? It needs to be this. It needs to match this chip. So it's different. So my two of my favorite products from Benjamin Moore is Aura Matte and Regal Matte. Regal Select Matte. I mean, they're beautiful. One of my favorite products from Sherwin-Williams is Cashmere Low Luster. So those are my three big ones. My three big ones. And then I have a couple products from Dunn Edwards, but fewer and fewer painters that I work with even bring up Dunn Edwards. It's kind of odd. But, there's a few from Dunn Edwards, but those are my three big ones. Regal and Aura Matte and Cashmere Low Luster. I like how they look. I like how they feel when you touch them, and I like how they hold up. So, but it's different. Like, this is the formula for Chantilly lace. Okay, 548 is the Regal Select Matte Base, and 522 is the Aura Matte Base. And you can see the formulas are different. It's for a gallon, and in the Regal, there's only S2, which I think is black, and in the Aura, there's a shot of white with the black to get Chantilly lace. Okay, so it's different product to product. So again, if you're trying to track the colorants and the proportions of colorants, now another layer to that track that you have to try to decipher and apply some logic and repeatability to is the formula changes from product to product. Okay, just complicating things even more. So the one thing that, and actually one of my paint store people told me this years and years ago, one of the things that a list of colorants can tell you is about hide. And he told me is, what he told me is more colorant improves hide. So that usually means it requires just the standard 2 coats. So a list of colorants, again, they don't describe what a color looks like, but more colorants, like this is Decorator's White, more colorants can be indicative of better hide, which means you need fewer coats. So this is Decorator's White with more colorant in it compared to Chantilly Lace with fewer colorants in it. And this is the Aura Matte Base for both of these. So that is one thing that the list of colorants can tell you. More colorants typically equates to better hide and fewer coats. So that is all I have to tell you about colorants and pigments and trying to decipher you guys have questions, I have comments, trying to decipher that. So Dory says, I need an easy way to convey this to clients. Yeah, it's a discussion. For sure it is. I don't know. I'll have to think about that, Dory. One example might be to actually invest in 2 quarts, one that is cut, and compare it to the original. And, you know, keep that in your bag. That might be something even include in my course kit for another module, because I don't talk about this in the 4 pillars of color because, you know, I don't spend time on things that aren't important. I don't see the list of colorants or the formula important. So that's why I don't talk about it in the 4 colors. It's like you can't control that. So why talk about it? The only thing you can control is understanding hue, value, and chroma and calibrating color from those 3 dimensions. And then go to the paint store. You don't do that in the paint store, right? Color consulting, color design doesn't happen at the paint store level. The paint store and samples is at the tail end of this whole process. It's the last steps, not the first steps. Yeah, so I don't know how to think about that, Dory. Jeff says it doesn't work that way in printing. There is a methodology in printing to calculate the tint of a spot ink. I know. And that's how I started out of the gate, Jeff, right? Because my background is in graphic design and ink. And when I got to the architectural space, I was like, what in the heck are you people doing? What are you even talking about? Messing with the formula like that? Because I understand what that means. But removing any of the CMYK doesn't necessarily make it lighter. I know, right? But in printing and in graphics, that is actually documented and explained, right? You can find experts who can speak to that cogently. That's not the case in architectural color. Like, you know, ask somebody at Benjamin Moore, what does 50% lighter in your system precisely mean in terms of the 3 dimensions of color? And you're going to have to ask a lot of people. It's a long road to get to the color scientists in the lab. It's a long road. Okay. Any other questions? No. Yeah, the conversations though, that is difficult. It's like, how do you explain that to someone simply? And you know, talking about why it doesn't work. It might be easier to talk about why hue, value, and chroma are so much easier and more effective. Right? It's like, yeah, I've heard that about the colorants, but let me show you how it works doing it this way. And then maybe that conversation will just go away. That's one idea. Instead of talking about what doesn't work, talk about what does work and why it works so well. Okay, so I'm gonna go. I actually started eating an oatmeal cookie. This is what's left. It's only 4:50 here. I don't know what we'll talk about tomorrow, but I'll think of something. Talk to you guys later.